Okay, I think we'll get started here. Welcome to CCC. We have a small crowd, so this is going to be really great because it'll be really informal. And so if you have any questions, just raise your hand or blurt it out or throw a piece of candy my way or whatever. And really informal stuff. The program tonight is part of this thing we're calling Flagstaff Lunar Legacy. Because if we go back in time to the 1960s, and we'll talk about this some, astronauts trained to go to the moon. It was one of the biggest achievements of mankind. And every astronaut who walked on the moon trained right here in Flagstaff, right in this neighborhood, in fact. And so what we want to do tonight is not go over all that stuff they did, like the Grand Canyon and Cottonwood and all these other places, but I want to talk about specifically some stuff that happened on the east side here. And in fact, some training that happened just down the road on 4th Street here. After that, I want to then talk about something else, and that's Neil Armstrong. Because in just a few days, the movie First Man opens here in Flagstaff on the 11th, and it's about Neil Armstrong. And he spent a lot of time here in Flagstaff. Well, I guess it's relative a lot of time. He came here several times as part of his training. I'll try to stand here so Wayne doesn't block our view here. So I want to do that as kind of part 2 of the program and kind of set the stage for First Man. Hopefully you'll go and see it. It's about Neil Armstrong and his preparations to be the first man to walk on the moon. And he did a lot of training in northern Arizona. And so like I said, really informal. This is, gosh, we can just almost do a question and answer sort of thing. A couple of people that I like to recognize in the crowd, Allie Applin, who's waving her hand frantically. She does PR here at Coconino Community College and is part of this whole Lunar Legacy celebration, which celebrates Flagstaff's role as preparing to go to the moon. Rich Kozak, who worked at the USGS for years and is an expert on a lot of the stuff we're talking about tonight. And I see this gentleman has a Lunar Legacy shirt on, and so you're free advertising for this whole thing. It's really neat because, going to the moon was one of the defining moments of our species. I mean, we think of, when we're going through life, there are certain events we remember exactly where we were at that time. Most of them are tragic. JFK assassination, 9/11. There are things that were just devastating. But going to the moon and those first steps on the moon by Neil Armstrong was a point where hundreds of millions of people took a moment, and it didn't matter what country they were in, they took a moment, and they weren't Russians or Americans or Yugoslavs or whatever, they were humans looking up at space and realizing as a species we accomplished something grand together. It's really a unique time, and one of those few times where we remember exactly where we were. And it started, you could say it started with 1957 with Sputnik going up into space, and that kind of started a new angle of the Cold War that we call the space race, when the Russians and Americans were trying to beat each other in space. Russians got the first satellite into space, the first person in space, the first female in space, the first double astronaut team or cosmonaut team in space. And so we were behind. And this was a different time when it really was an unspoken war where we were trying to vie for world supremacy. And so after Alan Shepard became the first American in space, he spent 15 minutes up in space in 1961. And with that, President John Kennedy declared that we're going to go to the moon. And we're going to do it before the end of the decade. That's how we're going to beat the Russians. And so, this wasn't something to go to space to learn about our universe, to be scientists. It was to beat the Russians to get up there. That's why we were going. But luckily, we had people like Gene Shoemaker here in Flagstaff and other scientists who said, what's the point of going to the moon unless you do science and learn about our universe? And thanks to him and others, we did all this training here in Flagstaff. But there's a lot of different ways you can look at the space race kicking off. Ellie?
Question. When Kennedy threw down that gauntlet, did he discuss this with NASA, or did he just make the challenge
Well, he discussed it with his insiders, and in fact, and he announced it in 1961, in just a couple weeks after Alan Shepard walked into space. After 15 minutes of being in space, he said, "We're going to the moon." 15 minutes. We have to figure out how to get the rockets to go there, how to keep people alive, how to live. And so he, working with his insiders, it wasn't his ideal situation. Kennedy, as hindsight shows in records that have been released in recent years, he wasn't really that excited about going to the moon. It's just that he saw it as a way, and his advisor saw it as a way of victory. And so he was initially kind of lukewarm about the whole thing. But he did discuss it, and he announced it to Congress and said, we're going to spend $1 gazillion and go to space. But you think about this. In 9 years, we're going to go from 15 minutes in space to going 250,000 miles away, staying alive, picking up rocks, planting the flag, coming back safely. How are you going to do that? Well, one of the things that's important is you have to have a legion of people behind and supporting it. The American people had to be behind it, otherwise it's going to be another farcical presidential declaration that falls by the wayside. So Kennedy, it doesn't matter what politics you are, Kennedy was well-spoken, he was witty, he was inspiring, and so, he realized if we're going to do this, we have to galvanize the American populace to get behind it. And so months after he told Congress that this is what my plan is, when the Manned Spacecraft Center was being dedicated in Houston, and that's what we know today as Johnson Space Center, he gave a speech at Rice University, which is next door. And in this speech, you can see how he was able to galvanize the American public. So let me play this. This is just a segment of the speech, but you can see how he was able to get Americans to really get behind this.
But I do say that space can be explored and mastered without feeding the fires of war, without repeating the mistakes that man has made in extending his writ around this globe of ours. There is no strife, no prejudice, no national conflict in outer space as yet. Its hazards are hostile to us all. Its conquest deserves the best of all mankind, and its opportunity for peaceful cooperation may never come again. But why, some say, the moon? Why choose this as our goal? And they may well ask, why climb the highest mountain? Why, 35 years ago, fly the Atlantic? Why does Rice play Texas? We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too.
Two important things from this video. One, Kennedy had a great speechwriter, and two, he had an ability to deliver that really galvanized people. I mean, when he gave a speech like this, everybody got excited. I shouldn't say everybody. There are a lot of people who said, why are we spending money, billions of dollars going to space, when we're starving here on Earth, when we're having riots, when the Vietnam War is going on? There are a lot of bad things going on in the late 60s. 1968 was, a few years later, was almost a disastrous year, and yes, space and going to the moon almost helped save that in a lot of ways. So Kennedy, he inspired people. 400,000 people, it's been estimated, helped to get to the moon. A lot of scientists and geologists and engineers right here in Flagstaff are included in that group. So Kennedy decides we're going to go to the moon. And, for him, it was, let's get there, let's plant the flag. We beat the Russians, huzzah. But people like Gene Shoemaker, scientist here in town, founder of the astrogeology branch of USGS, who brought it from California here to Flagstaff, said, if we're going to go to the moon, let's do science. Let's learn about that world. What's the point of planting a flag and coming back? It's a victory in some way, but if we don't take advantage to learn about it, it's a wasted opportunity. And so he and others talked to NASA and worked with NASA and showed them the value of doing science, going to the moon. But if you're going to go to do science on the moon, that means you have to train. We have mostly the astronauts, they're a bunch of test pilots. They're fighter jocks who go into aircraft. 1 in 3 or so die. They have a different mentality. They're wired differently than the rest of us. And so why should they care about picking up a bunch of rocks or doing geology? Well, Gene Shoemaker realized that this was going to be a little tough, and so thought, let's bring them to Flagstaff. Let's inspire them to learn about geology at the places like the Grand Canyon and do geology around Flagstaff. And so when he decided to bring astrogeology branch here to help train the astronauts, one of the first issues he had was, where do we go? We have no space here, and we're going to move here, and we got to start training right away. We need an office space. And so he talked to Edward Bridge Danson, who was the director of the museum in Northern Arizona, and said, for now, we need some space. We're going to be building a center, but initially we need some space. And Ned Danson said, okay, we'll put you up at the museum until you get more space. And I think most of you realize Ned Danson, his son is Ted Danson, the actor, who grew up here in Flagstaff. His dad was the director here. So the museum put up the USGS. Here's Gene Shoemaker right here. And here's on the campus of Northern Arizona University back in 1963. Look at the peaks in the background. So they set up shop here, but this wasn't enough. Eventually the USGS was going to build, Wayne's like, what does this have to do with the moon? Is this the wrong program? The USGS was going to eventually build a facility up on McMillan Mesa, but in the meantime, they needed other space. And I'm going to show you some of these spaces they used, because they rented garages and buildings around town. They rented space at the bank building downtown, Flagstaff skyscraper, 4 stories high or whatever it is. They rented 3 of the 4 floors there at one time. They rented other space. There's a building in the parking lot of Kachina. The building's no longer there. They rent a space there. The NACOG building on Aspen Street, they rent a space there. Mike's Pike, where the t-shirt shop is, they rented space there and had a petrology lab there where they evaluated rocks. So they rented a lot of space, including many here on the east side, which I'm going to show you. While they're renting these spaces, they're developing the new kind of home base for the USGS up on McMillan Mesa. And if you go back to 1963, 1964, the only thing you'd see up on McMillan Mesa was this guy named O.T. Gillette and some other folks around Flagstaff who had established Buffalo Park, the outdoor zoo that had buffaloes and all sorts of wildlife running around, and it served as a wildlife zoo for several years. So that was the only thing up there. But Gene Shoemaker worked with the city. They found the site and built what we know today as the astrogeology branch of the USGS there. So I think on this map, Buffalo Park is further down the road this way. And so they built this facility, and this was the original, what they called Building 1, to house the USGS.
What was Shoemaker's connection with Flagstaff?
Shoemaker's connection with Flagstaff, that's a good question. Gene Shoemaker was a geologist by trade, and he did his PhD dissertation on Meteor Crater. And he was the one, while geologists through the years believed that Meteor Crater might have been formed by the impact of some rock from space hitting it, Gene Shoemaker is the one that proved it in the early 1960s. And so he had a really strong connection to Flagstaff. He when he was studying Meteor Crater, he fell in love with the place. And really, as he started the astrogeology branch, which was intended to prepare for the moon missions, he realized that northern Arizona, not only did he love it here, but what a great place to train the astronauts, because the best preserved impact crater on Earth is right next door. If we want to inspire the astronauts to learn geology, let's take them to one of the most inspirational places there is, the Grand Canyon. We have these volcanic fields around here, similar to kind of what we think will be on the moon. And so he knew the area. That's why he brought USGS here. He loved it and realized it would be a good training ground. And so they set up the lab here. This is what the original inside looked like, a grand view of the San Francisco peaks here. And building 1 was the start of the USGS complex, which of course still stands today. Building 1 is no longer there, but the Shoemaker building is kind of the newest building there, kind of the center where the archives are stored, where there's a lot of great information stored there and such. But the USGS became the center of all this activity in Flagstaff. There was mapping going on at places like Lowell Observatory and USGS. But when we think about the preparations for Apollo, besides the moon mapping at Lowell, most of the preparations were centered around the USGS and this facility. I mean, they were not only training astronauts, but they developed instruments and tested them. You know, if you're going to go to the moon, where the atmosphere and the conditions are so different, you have 1/6 gravity, there's no air, it can get really hot or really cold. You have to prepare for everything. And so much of that preparation, not all of it, but a lot of it happened right here in Flagstaff, centered around the USGS. So much so that when the Apollo 11 mission happened in July of 1969, news stations came here and had kind of a base of operations. CBS News came here, and while Walter Cronkite was at Mission Control, they also flashed back to Flagstaff, where some of the preparations happened, and they would come back, they would flash in here and explain how Flagstaff contributed. They would explain what the astronauts were doing and so on. So this is one of the fellows from CBS talking to one of the geologists, Jack McCauley, during the Apollo 11 mission. Here's another shot during the Apollo 11 mission. While many of the scientists were in the back rooms at Mission Control, many others were right here at the USGS building. And this is what it looked like outside. They were not only at the USGS building, but also the man-made crater fields. If we think of where the landfill is, out in that area, the USGS created a couple man-made crater fields where the astronauts trained and the geologists, tested instruments and such. So they had television units out there also explaining what the astronauts were doing. In fact, one of the crews even got on top of this vehicle called the Mobile Geological Laboratory, or MOLAB, and did some of the filming from there. I mean, you think if you can go back in time, it feels like a sci-fi thing. It almost doesn't feel real because these weird space buggies are around here and cameras are showing up. It was really kind of a bizarre thing. So the USGS is establishing its base of operations over on McMillan Mesa, and center for the geology, for training, and so on. While that's happening, they realized that there wasn't enough space there, for one thing. The construction of the building wasn't done. That was part of the thing, but part of it was there just wasn't enough space to do all the different things that needed to be done. And we have mapping, and we have to practice collecting data. When the astronauts are radioing in to Mission Control what they're observing and the rocks they're picking up, there has to be somebody here on Earth that's receiving that and evaluating their observations and making sense of it. And so if we today, and when I say today, I'm literal because I took this picture this morning, if we today go down 4th Street, south just a little bit, we'll see the Dahl Building, which used to be blue up until recently. This building was originally put up as the data reception area for USGS. This is where they practiced, not only practiced, but received data and evaluated what the astronauts were seeing. This is kind of what it looked like when it first opened. These guys aren't scientists. They're not astronauts. These are Coconino County Superior Court reporters. Because one of the things, when the astronauts are on the moon and observing the geology and radioing back to mission control, these guys would receive that data and transcribe it and write it up quickly so that the geologists could quickly evaluate what they were looking at. So even court reporters were involved with this stuff. During the Apollo 12 mission, the second mission to the moon, this is what that building looked like on the inside. You had geologists, you had engineers. This is the geologist, Al Chichester, listening to what the astronauts were saying, and then looking at the maps and trying to pinpoint the location of where the astronauts were. Another geologist here. If we could enlarge this map shows the landing site of the Apollo 12 mission, generally. And then they're trying to evaluate exactly where they were and what they're collecting. Many of you might be familiar with Ivo Lukita, who still lives in town here and was involved with this. All part of the Apollo 12 mission in that building just down the road, the data collection facility. If we go to Northwest Street, another facility, this building is no longer here. This is an apartment building that's on this site. But when the USGS went to museum, they needed a big machine shop to design and build a lot of the equipment from hammers and other collecting devices to rovers and stuff like that. They needed a machine shop, and it turns out that the new building in McMillan Mesa had false floors, and it wasn't strong enough to support this heavy machinery. So they rented a building over at 1733 Northwest Street, and this is what it looked like inside. Again, today you go there and there's an apartment building there, but this is where they did a lot of the machinery. Another place that Wayne had mentioned earlier, if we go over to Huntington Road, over on just on the south side of the tracks, this is the U-Haul building today. If you want to rent a U-Haul, this is where you go. But if you went here back in the 60s, the USGS had rented it. This is what it kind of looked like in later years. They rented it, and they built this test vehicle here called Explorer. And if you look at this guy right here, he's one of the engineers, the guys who built this thing. His name is Dick Weiser. And Dick Weiser helped build this and helped build another rover I'll talk about in a few minutes. And this is what Explorer looked like when it was pretty much built. And it had, it's pretty basic. It doesn't have a lot to it. And they used this, they tested it out at Bonita Lava Flow at Sunset Crater and the man-made crater fields and other areas around northern Arizona. So that was built, if you go to U-Haul, that thing was built in that building. And then if you go over to Northeast Street, which is just, a couple blocks over, again, I took this picture this morning when I was taking my grand sweetie to school. And this building, and there's another one like it right next door. It's up on Northeast Street, a couple blocks north of Route 66. So it's pretty easy to find. This is what it looks like today. But back in the 1960s, it was another machine shop. And inside of it, this fellow named Bill Tinnen, and here's Dick Weiser, they were building another vehicle. Because, the early missions to the moon, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, on the first mission, they landed, they walked around a little bit, they collected some rocks, and they got out of there. But as the missions went on, Gene Shoemaker and other scientists really convinced NASA we need to do more science to make this worthwhile. And to do science, you have to do more than, if you're going to travel all that way, don't just walk a few hundred yards to look at the rocks. We need to travel miles to look at different rock outcrops and topographic features and such. So they developed rovers to be able to drive around. And there were several different prototypes of rovers that were developed and tested. One was called Grover the Rover. And Grover is the one, the prototype of the actual vehicle they used on the moon. So here is Dick Weiser and Bill Tinnen working on Grover. And here it is coming along a little bit further. And here's the finished product. And this is right outside that what's now a shop out on Northeast Street. And if you look at this is pretty basic. This thing is still around today, which I'll talk about in a second. But you know, something that I find really interesting about all this is, you know, we're talking about these things being built at a machine shop down the road or on the east side. You know, there are local people that were working on these things. Dick Weiser, I mentioned, was one of the guys working on this. His daughter, some of you may know her, is Sherry Mangum. And Sherry and Dick Mangum wrote several hiking guides to Flagstaff. And they're retired now. Dick Mangum was a judge in town. His father, Carl, was a judge in town. You see the Mangum Stoops sign. That's the Mangum family. So Dick and Sherry, when they were kind of in their early retirement years, they wrote several hiking guides and history guides about Flagstaff. Well, Sherry Mangum told me that, you know, when her dad, Dick Weiser, was building these rovers, she remembers Dad coming home one day. She was just a kid. She remembers Dad coming home one day and saying, you know, we're working on this vehicle, and we're trying to simulate the radar dish, but the thing we have just keeps falling down. And Sherry, the little kid, said, well, Dad, why don't you just use an umbrella for now? And so the next day, he stuck an umbrella on this thing, and sure enough, for what they needed, it worked for a while. So that's her tie to the Apollo stuff. It's, you know, it's an example, I think, of how cool it is of there's still so many people in this community that were somehow involved with all this. And it's not just, you know, we think of the astronauts as the peak of the pyramid. They're the ones who walked on the moon, but there are so many scientists and engineers and other people that were involved and their families. Today, I was down in Sedona earlier talking to some folks about this stuff, and there was a lady in the crowd that had come up from Tucson, and her dad, his name was Ray Batson. And Ray Batson was a moon mapper at the USGS, and she came up from Tucson just to hear the story and remember about when her dad was working on this, and she remembers going with the astronauts out in the field and training and stuff like that. It was really a neat thing. So these stories are still out there. The people are still here. So here's that building on Northeast Street. It doesn't look like this today. But back in the 60s, they had the Explorer and Grover, the rover. And here's this mobile laboratory, MoLab, and this big practice landing vehicle. A few years ago, I went over, I found this place, I don't know, 10 years ago maybe. And I'm taking a picture of this garage because it looks exactly the same, except for the vehicles. And the owner came out and said, who the hell are you? why are you taking pictures of this building? And I showed him this picture, and he had no idea that any of this had happened here. And for me, this is one of the reasons why Rich and Allie and I and others are talking about all this stuff this year. You know, we have this year where we're approaching the 50th anniversary of the first moon landing. And because so much of the preparations happen in Flagstaff, we want to preserve this heritage. We want to preserve the idea that just down the road, all these rovers were here. And this wasn't some sci-fi movie, this was the real thing. And so it's kind of a neat story. There's another kind of a personal story. Some of you might know this fellow, his name is Pat Madden. And Pat was the police chief in Flagstaff for years. And I don't know, sometime last year I was showing him some of these pictures. I was showing him this picture. And he said, you know, I remember back when I first started on the police force in Flagstaff, I got called to go to the east side because somebody had broken into that building. It turned out to be kids. And they were trying to they broke in because they were hoping to go joyriding on these rovers. And even if they were able to figure out how to start it, they wouldn't have got very far because they didn't travel very fast. But it's neat because there's these folks that are still around that have these personal stories. When I mentioned this today to the group in Sedona, Ray Batson's daughter said, I think that was my brother who did that, and he got in a lot of trouble. But don't tell anybody, because he still got in trouble for it. So, anyways, it's neat because it's all this stuff isn't some foreign story that happened in Florida or Texas. So much of it is in our backyard here. If we look today, we go to the USGS. Remember the Grover the rover, this one right here, that was used to test at the cinder fields around here and other places. This is now on display at the USGS, along with Brad Pitt. You can go there and see him today. So this is on display there. And remember that other vehicle, the mobile laboratory. If you go down to Huntsville, Alabama, you can see it on display there. So these artifacts are around. In fact, if you want to hear more about this, you might talk to Rich afterwards, because he's taken his son to space camp here and seen this in recent years. So these artifacts are around, but the stories are kind of getting lost with time. So that's why we want to kind of tie this stuff in. So just really kind of briefly overviewing, there's several, Flagstaff played an important role in preparing to go to the moon, and so much of it happened within just a couple miles of where we're standing right here. The east side always gets the short, straw when we talk about Flagstaff history. Everything is kind of West Flagstaff centric, but so much happened right over here, and I think it's a heritage we want to make sure to preserve. So that's a little bit about what happened on this side of town. The other thing I wanted to mention was the movie. This movie is coming out. It opens this Thursday in Flagstaff, called First Man, and it's a story about Neil Armstrong and the eventual flight to the moon, Apollo 11, taking the first steps. It's kind of neat because this movie it's Hollywood, but the producers and the writers have really gone out of their way to try to make it as accurate as possible as Hollywood goes. And so while there's going to be some things that are kind of, anybody in those is going to say, what the heck were they thinking? They're Hollywoodizing it, if that's a word. But they really tried to make it as accurate as possible. They worked with Neil Armstrong's family, his two sons, his widow, his first wife, before she passed away a few months ago, to try to really capture the accuracy and the feeling of the whole thing. And according to family members, they really captured it pretty well. So when you guys go and see this about Neil Armstrong, it doesn't cover his time in northern Arizona, but I think it's still kind of a cool thing for us to talk about that for a few minutes, because so much of what he achieved was because of what he did in northern Arizona. Neil Armstrong, we think about the first American astronauts. There's the Mercury 7, which were named in 1959, Alan Shepard, Gus Grissom, John Glenn, and so on. They were the first ones to go up in space. And once they went into space, that's when President Kennedy said, okay, we're going to go to the moon. If we're going to go to the moon, we need a lot more astronauts. So the second group, the next 9, were brought in 1962. And these were, you think about the astronauts, the first ones to go into space, Shepard and Glenn and so on, were remarkable. But this class, 6 of the 9 missions that went to the moon, 6 of the commanders came from this class. The first man to walk on the moon, the first American to walk in space, were all from this group. So pretty impressive group. Impressive until you look at this picture and you think, what a bunch of goofballs. Pete Conrad, this fellow here, said NASA has figured out how to squeeze 26 hours into a 24-hour day. These guys were always working. They were spending weeks away from home. Their home life was, almost a disaster, because they're always away training. And so when they could have a less serious moment, they could. And this picture is great. Frank Borman, who went to Tucson High School, In fact, he was the starting quarterback on the 1946 state championship Tucson High School football team. John Young walked on the moon. A couple others. Pete Conrad walked on the moon. Jim Lovell, from Apollo 13. Ed White, the first American in space. But when we think of astronauts, who do we think of? We think of John Glenn, and we think of Neil Armstrong, the first man to walk on the moon. Here he is, being pretty silly. And so these guys were brought in 1962, and they were going to be the saviors, the ones to get us to the moon. And so Neil Armstrong was part of that class. He was an engineer, a quiet, soft-spoken person. And as it turns out, the perfect person to be the first one to walk on the moon. It wasn't preordained that he would be the first one. It worked out, it just was chance. Some of the astronauts died, missions got changed around, and it just happened to be Apollo 11 went to the moon. But in hindsight, he was almost the perfect person to be the first one. So let me go back a second here. 1962, September, NASA announces the second group of astronauts. And this is when Gene Shoemaker said, if we're going to go to the moon, let's do geology. If we're going to do geology, what better place to train than Flagstaff? The astronauts ended up training in a lot of places: Iceland, Hawaii, Oregon, Mexico, New Mexico, a lot of other places. But a lot of the training was centered here in Flagstaff because USGS was here, and also because of the great natural geologic features here. And so a lot of the training happened here. Gene Shoemaker, when he was trying to convince NASA to do training, he said, a great place for training is Flagstaff. All this, the cinder fields, the Grand Canyon, and so on. Why don't you bring the astronauts out here, and we'll just do a test run to see if this is really worthwhile. So in 1963, in January 16th, is minus 7 degrees. And a couple of planes show up at Pulliam Airport, which was located in a different building, not the terminal we see today, a different building. 2 different planes land in the morning carrying the 9 astronauts and some geologists. And they came on 2 planes in case one of them crashed. Not all the astronauts would be killed. They traveled a lot that way. So they arrived at the airport, and they checked into their hotel at the Highway House, which was the Del Webb Hotel in the 60s. Today, Walgreens on 4th Street, this is where that is right now. So 4th Street is right here. This is the corner of 4th Street and Route 66. That was a Del Webb Hotel. That's where they stayed in 1963. So the idea was, let's just spend a day in Flagstaff, see if it's worthwhile to do geology training here. So they went to Meteor Crater. If you're going to go to the moon with all these impact craters, what better place to train than a place like Meteor Crater, the best preserved impact crater on Earth? So here's Gene Shoemaker showing them what a real impact crater looks like. They went to other cinder volcanic features in the area like Sunset Crater. And then they went up to Lowell Observatory. And at Lowell Observatory, they had dinner at this house. And this house was just finished. It was the director's house. And the reason I show this picture is because last year we had this really cool solar eclipse. It was partial here in Flagstaff. A couple of years before that, we had an annular eclipse in Flagstaff. And this is the side. This is the garage of that house where the astronauts had dinner. And you notice all these little crescents here. Those are all eclipses. The sun shining through leaves. They're acting as little diffraction gratings, pinhole viewers, and creating all these images of the moon. So the astronauts went here for dinner. And then later on, after dinner, here's Jim Lovell signing the autograph book of the observatory, which is now on display up there. After dinner, they went over and went to the mapping area. And they learned how the astronauts, or how the scientists were doing mapping. They signed a guest book here. Here's Neil Armstrong's signature right here. Tom Stafford. Let's see, here's John Young. Jim Lowell is right here. So they did some of that stuff. They went over to this building where the moon mapping was being done, and they talked to people like E.C. Slifer, who was an astronomer there. So here's Tom Stafford and Neil Armstrong at the building up at Lowell, looking they're actually looking at Mars maps here, but looking how they're depicting features on maps. You know, they saw an actual impact crater, a meteor crater. Now they're looking at seeing how scientists depict these features on maps, because when they fly to the moon, they're going to have to look at pictures and maps to identify their location and to identify these features. So they went here to do that. And here is Pete Conrad with Pat Bridges. Pat Bridges lives about 5 blocks from where we're standing right now. She's still here today. She lives part of the time here, part of the time in Phoenix. She was the main moon mapper up at the observatory. So here she is, I don't know, 55 years ago now, showing Pete Conrad how she does these drawings with airbrushes. And then before they left, astronomer E.C. Slifer had his own personal autograph book, and he had all the astronauts sign it. And again, this is 1963, 6 years before the moon mission, and yet of all the astronaut signatures, most of them said, best wishes, thanks a lot. Neil Armstrong said, may our contributions to your work be as helpful as your contributions to ours. Just a really poetic thought. And in hindsight, realizing he was the first one to walk on the moon is really a touching thing he wrote. So the astronauts saw a real impact crater during the day. They saw how impact craters were depicted on maps. And then after that, they split up into 3 groups. Some of them went to the Lowell Observatory's Clark telescope. Some of them went to the Naval Observatory. And some of them, including Neil Armstrong, went to Northern Arizona University's observatory and viewed the moon through the telescope. And for some of them, apparently it was the first time they looked at the moon through a telescope and said, so this is where we're going. And so Neil Armstrong and the other next 9 used these instruments to really kind of get a feel for where they're going. So this was really important training. The stuff that Armstrong and his fellow next 9 astronauts did showed NASA that coming to Flagstaff and doing geology training in general is really worthwhile. So all the future Apollo astronauts came to Flagstaff. Everyone who walked on the moon or flew to the moon trained here. They went to the Grand Canyon, they went to Meteor Crater, and so on, and trained in this area. I should mention the next day after they did observing, after about, in some cases 3 or 4 hours sleep, they went to NAU and looked at some maps. Here's Art Adel. You might recognize his name, the Adel Mathematics Building. And here's Neil Armstrong, Gene Shoemaker, Jim Lowell, some of the other astronauts at the end of that training period. It's kind of cool because they were just here, most of them were here just for 24 hours, but Frank Borman and Jim Lowell and one of the others stayed here the next day, and they ended up going back to Sunset Crater. They went up to Snowbowl just to check out Snowbowl and get the view. And then they went to Flagstaff High School to talk to students, and they had an assembly there. And when they introduced Frank Borman, according to the Arizona Daily Sun, 2 of the girls fainted because he's an astronaut. These guys, it was like the Beatles were coming to town. They were rock stars, and that's the reaction that people had. So really, pretty neat stuff. So that was that first visit. Showed NASA that Northern Arizona is a great place to do this training. So let's bring the astronauts back and extend their training. Let's take them to the Grand Canyon, because if we really want to inspire them to learn geology, these test pilots, we need to take them to one of the most inspiring geologic classrooms on Earth, the Grand Canyon. And again, this is just to me remarkable. You go through the U.S. Geological Survey's database of pictures, and they have several dozen pictures of the astronauts of the Grand Canyon in 1964 and 1966. And so many of the pictures focus on Neil Armstrong and a couple other astronauts that were in his group that hiked down. There's a bunch of pictures of them. It's almost as if somebody knew that he was going to be the first one, although they didn't. But this is probably, gosh, this is one of my favorite pictures of astronauts in northern Arizona. This is Neil Armstrong gazing across the Grand Canyon. And you just wonder what he's thinking, having no idea that in, 5 years, he's going to be the first person to walk on the moon. And here he is, training to be a geologist. He's got his geology hammer. He's got this booklet that holds maps. He's got his hand lens. What's he thinking right now when he's looking across the canyon? I don't know, it's hard to say. And you also wonder what he's thinking here when he's coming out of the canyon. Like, what the hell was I thinking riding this mule out of here? He looks pretty miserable. He and the other astronauts, they started at the Yavapai Geology Museum, got briefed on the geology of the Grand Canyon. And, when we think about this, the Grand Canyon is layer upon layer of rock, a lot of sedimentary rock. It's not what they expected to find on the moon, but it was more of not only inspiring the astronauts to want to learn geology, but also, kind of large-scale overarching geology, how rocks are laid down, the superposition of rocks, which, the younger ones are on the top, the older ones are on the bottom. Going to a place like the Grand Canyon where it's all in front of your eyes to learn how to interpret what you're looking at. And so that's why they went there. And yeah, I just love this picture because he just looks miserable. And it's, it's cold. You can see it's toward the top of the canyon. There's snow, lying here. It's probably pretty darn cold. He's living in Houston, got thin blood by now. And so, it's got to be miserable. So let me go back a second. So Neil Armstrong, when you watch the movie, remember, he came here in 1963 for training. He went to the Grand Canyon in 1964. And then he came back years later. 49 years after he trained, he was back here in 2012. And here again, we have Brad Pitt with somehow my wife and daughter got in the picture. And Neil Armstrong, in 2012, 49 years after he trained to go to the moon, he came back to Flagstaff to help dedicate Lowell Observatory's new Discovery Channel telescope, one of the world's most powerful instruments. And he came back because it was an engineering marvel. He was an engineer. He wasn't so interested about riding the train of, I was the first on the moon, come see me. In fact, he initially turned down the invitation to come here, but he eventually came because the Discovery Channel telescope is an engineering marvel, and he got it. He was an engineer. He wanted to celebrate that. So he came back to Flagstaff. He gave a presentation at the High Country Conference Center. It was the largest crowd that HCC has ever had, 700 plus people crammed in there. The next day, he went out to the Discovery Channel telescope. Some of you may know Jeff Hall, the director of Lowell Observatory. He and other staff gave a tour of the telescope. One of the astronomers, Stephen Levine, they're standing right in front of the Discovery Channel telescope. And it's kind of a touching thing because, at the time, for all of us in Flagstaff, it was just nerdy. It's like, Neil Armstrong's here, isn't that cool? But this turned out to be his last public appearance. He died just a couple weeks after this. So his last public appearance was in Flagstaff, where he had prepared to go to the moon, and now he was dedicating this instrument that was going to further our understanding of the cosmos. Just really a neat kind of coming around of sorts. So this is kind of funny, this guy that was so private, when he came back and visited the Discovery Channel telescope, he wrote his name and also his telephone number. This guy that was so against media and that sort of thing, he wrote his telephone number here. Turned out to be his last public appearance, right here in Flagstaff, Arizona. So when you watch the First Man movie, just think of Neil Armstrong coming here and his fellows coming, close to where we are right now, going to the USGS, going out to the Cinder Fields, to Meteor Crater, up to Lowell Observatory for that training, And then in Neil Armstrong's case, coming back again because of the science that's being done here, the engineering that's being done in Flagstaff. It's a really great testament, I think, to our community and our dedication to science. The oldest running festival of science in the country, guess where it is? Right here in Flagstaff, because we not only have the natural resources, we as a community have the appreciation of advancing our knowledge of the universe. It's really neat, inspiring stuff. So that's a brief introduction to Flagstaff's role, especially on the east side, but also Neil Armstrong's place in Flagstaff and the heritage of our, what we call our space legacy. So thanks for coming in tonight. And like I said, this is really informal, so if you have any questions, we can take them now, or if you want to talk about more stuff, or any corrections, or if you have any stories or anything like that, now's a good time to talk about that. The question was, why wasn't Gene Shoemaker ever considered to go to the moon? He wanted to go to the moon. In fact, his widow, Carolyn, who is still alive and had made a name for herself in discovering comets, she said that was his lifelong dream, but he ended up that he had a rare disease called Addison's disease, which meant he couldn't go into space. And so for him, the next best thing was if he couldn't go to space, he was going to train the people that did go to space. So, and there's something poetic about this. When the Lunar Prospector flew up to the moon, Lunar Prospector is a spacecraft that went up in the 90s. Gene Shoemaker had passed away in 1997, I think it was. An astronomer that was one of his students pushed to have some of his ashes flown on board that spacecraft. Carolyn agreed, thought it was a fitting tribute. So Gene Shoemaker ended up going to the moon after all. His ashes flew to the moon. After the Prospector finished this mission, it crash landed onto the moon, and some of his ashes are there. And it's so neat because, I mean, how many people, when they've passed away, their ashes have gone into space? It's not many. But there's another one, Clyde Tombaugh, who discovered Pluto. The New Horizons mission, when it was launched, they put some of his ashes on that mission, and it flew past Pluto, and he finally got there himself. And he was a Flagstaff scientist. He discovered Pluto here also. So it's almost, it gives you goosebumps. You think about science and space, and we almost take it for granted, but Gene Shoemaker and Clyde Tombaugh, right here in our backyard. It's really remarkable, the heritage we have here. And that's why we have this Flagstaff Lunar Legacy celebration that goes on through the end of 2019. It's to make sure we permanently preserve this heritage. It's not just a footnote, yeah, they came here and trained, that's it. It's a heritage that continues today. Astronauts are still coming here to train. Next year, the USGS is going to be hosting modern astronauts who are preparing for not moon missions, but Mars missions. Missions that aren't even planned yet, but they're just developing techniques and procedures. They're going to be coming in the next year. This stuff is still happening today. And also you think of Flagstaff as a railroad town, a lumber town. It's also a science town. Going back to the beginnings, scientists were rubbing elbows with the lumbermen and the cattlemen and sheepmen and so on. So I feel like a preacher up here. But it's so cool, the heritage we have. And so I think it's important that we preserve that. And to me, it's really an honor to be talking about this at the community college. And you think, what's the community college have to do with the moon missions? CCC wasn't around in 1969 when this happened, but it's still, CCC is dedicated to education and the pursuit of knowledge. And that's exactly what Apollo did. And CCC, does anybody know what CCC's motto is, or the mascot is? Besides Rich, besides you two, it's the comets. Because this community is devoted to pursuing the universe, including comets. And CCC next year is hosting a gala on July 20th, 2019, the 50th anniversary, is going to be hosting a gala that celebrates all this stuff. So it's really neat to be able to talk about this here at CCC and to work with Ali on this, because it really is a community-wide celebration that we want to make sure isn't just a one-off, okay, the 50th, that's it. It's something that we permanently, that's part of our permanent heritage, because it's so important, I think. Yep.
What's the last thing you walked from here to?
Oh, see, it's like, here's the feeder question for you. The question was, wasn't the last man to walk on the moon from Flagstaff? Jack Schmidt, Harrison Jack Schmidt, was a geologist, and he was hired to work here at the USGS. I guess it's over there, at the USGS. And I was saying that the first astronauts were jet pilot or fighter pilots, test pilots. Then there were fighter pilots, and then NASA finally kind of succumbed to pressure from the scientific community, and who said, if we're going to send people to the moon, let's send scientists, because they know what they're looking for. We can train astronauts to do geology, but why not have trained geologists go there? And so the fourth or fifth group of astronauts were astronauts. They were all scientists. One of them was a geologist named Jack Schmidt, who had went to Harvard. He had ties with Gene Shoemaker. So he was working at the USGS here in Flagstaff when he was chosen to be an astronaut. In fact, it's a cool thing. I think it was 1965 when he entered the astronaut corps, and the local paper, the Arizona Daily Sun, has a story, Flagstaff has its own astronaut. The only scientist to ever go to the moon, and he was a Flagstaff guy. And in this story, announcing that he was going to be an astronaut, at the bottom, it gives his address. So here's, the newest astronaut. He's this young, single guy, good looking. And by the way, here's his address. It's great. It's great. And so you can look up at the Daily Sun, and they have that in there. So Jack Schmidt, he was originally slated to be on Apollo 19, Apollo 18, but NASA along the way cut the last couple missions, and so a scientist wasn't going to make it. But the scientific community pushed so hard that NASA bumped another astronaut on Apollo 17, Joe Engle, and put a scientist on instead, and he was able to go to the moon. And really, I mean, you can just imagine, my degree's in geology, so I can just imagine, one of us is up there. He's walking on the moon, this guy that studied geology all his life, and he's on the moon collecting rocks. I mean, what a ultimate experience. It's such a neat thing. And Jack Schmidt is still alive. He's there's four of the 12 moonwalkers are still alive. Buzz Aldrin, Jack Schmidt, Charlie Duke, and Apollo 15, Dave Scott. Yeah, so there are 4 of the 12 that are still alive. And we're looking at having 1 or 2 of them here next year, in fact, to talk about their experiences. So, cool stuff. Oh, we keep talking all night about this. All right, thanks everybody for coming in. Nice intimate group. And so if you want to learn more about this, I've got a few flyers. Flagstaff Lunar Legacy that the city has put out. There's a website on here that has all the events. And this celebration, as we're calling it, is going through the end of 2019. And the CCC is offering monthly lectures at the Lone Tree campus. And then there's also, hikes and talks. There's more than 100 events that are going on. So there's a lot of good stuff going on. So, yeah, Wayne, thanks. We also, kind of leading up to this lunar celebration, astronomy historian Bill Sheehan and I put together one of these Images of America books, and it kind of captures some of the spirit of this with its pictures of the mapping and the astronaut training, the instrument testing and stuff. So if you want some of those, we're selling those here tonight. But it's kind of something we've used as a tool, as an easy way of showing, look at all the stuff that happened here. And it's been really useful because the LA Times has done a story about this. The Dallas Morning whatever is getting close to doing a story. And as the excitement about 11, between the movie opening this week, the 50th anniversary of Apollo 8 with Earthrise. Next year's Apollo astronaut 11. There's going to be a lot more attention coming to Flagstaff. It's kind of neat because it's going to be just like it was during the moon missions. You know, just like when New Horizons flew by Pluto, the media just flocked to Flagstaff to see where it all started, where it all happened. And the same thing is happening in Flagstaff. So, cool stuff. Okay, thanks.